Welcome everybody. I'm going to show the general results of our project. It's hard to summarize thousands of pages into 30 minutes. I'm going to try. I have too many slides, I'm sure. So they're always going to be available to download after the conference. So don't feel that if you miss something that it's gone forever. I'm going to talk about two main things, two lessons that we learned in this project. And one is about the developments, because we were asked to look at evidence on how Europe is changing. And we also looked into the future. I'm going to talk to you about lessons that we learned from that, and also about how you can change these developments, and some lessons we learned about that, and what are good ways to go about changing the path of urbanization and land use. So going to the beginning of our project, this came from a call for tender that various institutes were invited to investigate. And it was asked to look at how sustainable land use can be promoted and how land take and urban sprawl can be avoided, reduced, compensated in Europe, blah, blah, blah. What we did is we decided, yes, this is very interesting, it's very pertinent, but we are going to change the terminology slightly. So you see that what we call this is not land take. We say, well, land is not being taken, it's not being removed, it's not vanishing. What's happening is that land is being converted from one function to another. So we decided to use this as urbanization and talk about it in this way. It was less pejorative. And the same thing for urban sprawl. We're talking, well, maybe, I think people are really talking about urban forms, and they're talking about diffuse urban forms rather than compact urban forms. So we decided to use this more as a method of analysis of the European territory than just to label something sprawl and then try to measure it. And the same thing for sustainability. We decided to take a very broad view of this and look at all three dimensions of sustainability. Sometimes we even looked at institutional and financial sustainability, but generally we looked at the three well-known pillars of sustainability of economy, ecology, and social. And if you're looking at the way we did this research, there's a lot that's already known. We know a lot on the left side about the drivers of urbanization and changing land use, that there's drivers on the demand side, more people, more GDP, they're driving development. Also on the supply side, because it's very lucrative to change land from one use to another, so there's also that. And on the right side, you kind of know what's coming out, because we had very good data on land cover, and we could see quite well what was happening between 2000 and 2018. And you can look at that in quantitative terms, in just totaling up changes in land use, but also qualitative about what's the form of the development. But the causality, that's very difficult to establish. That's a black box. And we decided in our project to open up that black box by asking people in a survey about what kinds of interventions they felt were having an impact. And also going really deep in on 11 case studies and trying to find out from the ground how land use is converted and what role do interventions, what we call interventions, that stands for policies, strategies, fiscal measures, you name it, how those things affect land use. So now I'm going to show you what we call the evidence of how land use has changed in Europe since 2000. And starting here, we have some very nice maps that was produced by the BBSR, our German partner. And this shows on the right the changing percentage share of urban. And you see it's growing and growing and growing. So there's a lot more urban development happening in Europe. There's a target now for zero net land take. So to basically stop urban development by 2050. You can see in the last 20 years, that's not happening at all. There's about 250 football fields we calculated. That's about 180 hectares per day that's being converted from non-urban to urban. And you see on the left, there's a flow chart of what kinds of land use. Mainly that's agriculture, from agriculture to urban. So there's some nature as well. That's at the European level. What's happening if you zoom in on countries? What do you then see? Who's urbanizing the most? Well, look at the big builders. Who's converting the most? It's the big countries. Well, that's not a big surprise, perhaps. Spain really takes the lead, also followed by Germany and France. Spain has a lot of construction sites mapped out, which means that maybe if those don't pan out, they could be converted back. You see some member states or some ESPON countries which are declining in the amount of urbanization that's occurring in periods. So it was more in the 2006 period than in more recent periods. Now you see also Spain, France, Netherlands, Ireland. And you see some areas where it's increasing. It's on the rise. So Europe is going at different speeds. That's, for example, in Poland and the UK. And in Poland, you also see a huge amount of development in infrastructure and also construction sites. And maybe you see here the effect of structural funds as well. But is it fair to judge every country and every region the same? Not particularly. You have certain regions which are growing and certain regions they're declining. And yeah, almost nobody is getting to that 0 hectare per day goal. So this I thought was a nice analysis where we just take the averages, the average population development and the average urbanization rate, and just make a topology of that and see where your region is according to the European average. And so if you happen to be in a light red category, you might want to think about there's something about sustainability here, because you're urbanizing faster than your population growth on average. And light blue, your population is growing slightly more than the urbanization rate. So maybe this is slightly more compact. Again, these are averages rather than you'd still have to investigate this closer to the ground. But this gives you kind of an area, a general view of how your region is moving according to the European average. Of course, that's just the growth, the conversion of land from one land use to another. It doesn't say anything about what people say is urban sprawl, because you can grow in, let's say, a very compact urban way with lots of attention for bicycles and for public transit, et cetera, or you can grow in a very scattered way with lots of roads, and that will make a big difference in terms of sustainability. So we want to also capture this idea of urban form. How are these regions growing, not just in terms of quantitative, but more in qualitative ways. So in the end, what we did is rather than try to create a machine learning tool to guess this, we decided just to use our own eyes and look at regions and evaluate all 1,400 regions in the entire European Union and ESPON space. Sorry, that's slightly larger. And say, what kind of region is this? So if you look on the left, you see one big blob and a lot of little villages. So we said that looks like kind of monocentric and then rather diffuse around. And on the right hand, you see 2 blobs and then very scattered development outside. So we decided there are 2 main structures here. What you first see of the main blobs of urban development, and then what you see outside. And so we did an analysis on these 2 levels for every region. And once we've done that, we could make maps of what we call the main structure, what you first see in terms of urban form, and on the right hand, what you see left over. And of course, on the right hand, it's a bit more diffuse than the left hand, but you also see quite large variations in Europe. You see some areas which are much more diffuse than others, and that would indicate what some people would say urban sprawl. Zooming on this region, you can see some very large variations, for example, between Denmark and Poland. Oh yeah, and this one is actually the changes in substructure. So this is just changing from 2000. So if you're saying that what's happened in the recent past, are you developing in a diffuse or a compact way? You would say, well, maybe there's something going on in Poland here where there's a lot of diffuse development happening in the last 20 years. So knowing what happened in the past, in the last 20 years, we thought, well, we could then expand that to the future and use these same types of philosophies of different urban forms and project that into future and say, well, what would happen in terms of sustainability if we were to travel down the road of compact development or diffuse development or something in between the polycentric development, which actually is the most common development in Europe, according to our analysis. So we created these three scenarios, which I think for many people are rather recognizable and familiar. And we fed that into a land use allocation model. And the model is blind. It just takes inputs, and the input was population development and GDP and that sort of thing that creates demand for urban development. And then it allocates that demand to what it thinks are the best suitable places. So there's a baseline in this, which was actually quite diffuse. And it after reallocates, you rerun the model every 5 years until you get to which our targeted time was 2050, when the land take is supposed to be at 0. So we created these three scenarios. I'm just going to show you two, which are the most extreme, the compact versus the diffuse. This is the model output for all of Europe. You don't see so much at the pan-European level. But if you zoom in, you do see quite big difference. So here, looking at Belgium, this is what happens in the compact scenario. Dark red is new development, and light red is existing development. And you see it really attaching on to edges of cities and very contiguous. If you look at the diffuse, you see it everywhere, splintered development along roadways and clinging on to small previous developments. So you can have a discussion, of course, going back and forth with policymakers about what kind of urban development do you prefer? What do you think is something that you would like? Would you like to steer it in one way or the other way? And what would the impacts be on sustainability for these two different models? Here's zooming in on parts of Germany, southern Germany. Here's the compact side. There's the diffuse side. You don't see it very much because we're zoomed out, but it's actually just as much or more development than the compact. Here's the Baltic region. It's also not so much difference. That has partly to do with the difference in population development. Yeah, we have some Lithuanian colleagues here, so zooming into their capital city, you also see some differences. Again, big caveats here. This is not really a prediction. This is just say an exercise in if you were to give an algorithm some parameters, what would happen? So it doesn't really know about what preferences are on the ground. It doesn't know anything about existing land use zoning plans, that sort of thing. But we say it's just a good springboard for discussion about what you think is a good idea. And if there seems to be a tendency towards a certain structure, do we think that's a good thing or not? If it's not, let's have a discussion about how to avoid that future. The model also allows you, of course, to total things up. So you can look at the total urban growth over time, see if you can get as a, let's say, EU level to zero net land take. Also population densities, according to the model, which areas are getting more and more dense. All that's possible with a model. But this is maybe even more interesting, and it's a very big table, and I don't expect anyone to read all of this, but here we have a lot of indicators according to our three dimensions of sustainability: the economic, ecological, and social. And based on a literature review, the scientific literature, we made pluses and minuses, whether or not in this mode of development, the literature says this is more or less a positive thing for sustainability on this particular indicator. And what we found is, yes, compact development has many advantages, but also some disadvantages. And even within the realm of ecological sustainability, there are trade-offs to be found. So we as scientists can't make these decisions. It's a political decision because it involves trade-offs. So getting to the conclusion here, we say you can learn from the future and the past. So we looked at the urban form, and we see that a lot of this is inherited. So there's not much you can do about, let's say, the main structure. That's something that many times is hundreds and hundreds of years old. You're stuck with that. But the substructure, yes, and especially the developments of substructure, that does seem to be differing from region to region. So this also probably shows that you have some latitude to change those kinds of developments. So then looking to the future, what kind of developments would you prefer? The compact, the diffuse, or the polycentric? And to make that decision, you can look at those maps and say, do we really think it's a good idea to develop these particular sites or not to urban? What would that mean for our region as a whole? Would that create a kind of path dependency to a different type of urban structure that we would want or not want? What would happen with car use? Public services, can we service all these areas? All these kinds of things you can think about. And of course, the trade-offs. What's air quality going to be like? What's water quality going to be like? How does this conform to our changing preferences? Carolus said in the very beginning that preferences seem to be changing because of COVID. Maybe the diffuse scenario links better with what the preferences are in our region, for example. So then we should look at some of the trade-offs there. What would happen if we were to go down that route? Again, this is a very political decision, and we as scientists can just give, let's say, the tools to make these decisions. The second part of the talk is about how to influence this, because you see that these have changed over time. They will change in the future. And we also feel that there is some latitude, some scope for changing the course of these land use developments. So what did we do? First thing we did is we surveyed and we bothered all our friends and people in our network and said, please, can you give us any examples of an intervention in your region which has influenced land use change, any at all? So we were collecting as much as we could, and we got over 200 of them. And you see here on the map, they're spread throughout all of Europe. It's not a random sample by any means. It's more snowballed. So you see certain areas are more well represented than others. Many times the regions where our partners were from, because we knew those the best. But yet there's quite a few. And so then when we looked at these interventions, we asked, what are also the impacts on sustainability? And were these interventions considered successes or not? And what kind of interventions were they? Were they hard zoning rules, or were they subsidies, or just ideas, best practices being disseminated to give people inspiration? What kind of interventions were these? I'll give you a few examples, really pertaining to the idea of sustainable land use. One is on the densification side. So very simple rule in Malta. Central government just said, we grant permission to add an extra floor to your building. And so this, of course, creates a lot of development. It overrides local land use plans. And yeah, we didn't really look too much into how what the impact of this was, because it's very recent, but it's an interesting one. And I'm sure that this would have, in addition to effects on densification, perhaps also some side effects as well in terms of livability. Luxembourg also wanted densification, but did it in a much different way. It created a database of all the gaps in urban structure, which are suitable for development, but weren't yet developed. So, and then it would contact the landowners and say, hey, are you interested in developing this? Is there anything preventing you? That sort of thing. So it's much more of a voluntary basis. And in Reggio Emilia, they were trying to dezone areas which were zoned for urban use but hadn't been used. So say, well, if you either use it or lose it, and if you lose it, well, then you can take that away and densify other areas. You can also affect urban land use by containment, by saying, no, there's a maximum you can develop. So Andalusia worked with urbanization caps for their larger municipalities. Lower Austria, a bit like Luxembourg, took a softer approach, said, hey, here's a cost calculator on infrastructure and services for municipalities. And if you look at, let's say, diffuse development, it might turn out that this is much more expensive for you as a municipality to service. And Denmark, a bit harder approach. They were putting restrictions and bans on large-scale shopping malls outside of town. So different ways of dealing with these issues. We also did some in-depth case studies, and I'm just showing you the fact sheets, which is in our super handbook, but we also have entire case study report, which you can really go into depth and see how the intervention worked in practice. And lessons learned here, for example, in Spain, they were trying to protect this area around Valencia, and it turned out that it was worked out better politically to broaden the scope from just ecological to also economic and social. And similar thing in Austria, the participatory processes and getting everyone on board, that was the key to getting the vision approved. So that was more on the governance side. In Germany, we found, and I can be very quick because Volker is here, there's a very, very clear target, about 30 hectares per day maximum, but the implementation was very, very complex. So it's not at all entirely sure that we're going to meet this target or how to meet this target. And in Switzerland, we had a target which was really backed by popular demand. This was voted on in a referendum, an anti-sprawl sentiment in Switzerland, and it could really impose stricter rules because that was the will of the people. So we also analyzed all the interventions. We didn't find very much correlations at all. So it turns out that you have good zoning examples and bad zoning examples and best practices for subsidies and worst practices for subsidies. So we couldn't tell you a whole lot about that. But the explanations of why things work, we found some consistency there. And those are also very familiar. Things like getting everyone on board, good communication, good collaboration. These were always found very important, regardless of what kind of measure you were trying to implement. So we say we have a toolbox of all sorts of different strategies. Go ahead and try to use the one that's most suitable for your region and for the area. And the best practices is not necessarily the tool, but how to use the tool. So we gave some advice on that. So getting to the final conclusions of everything, we found in the case studies where we really interviewed stakeholders on the ground and asked them, did this have an effect? And most of them said, yes, we do see effects. And so that gives us some feeling of, yes, it does matter, luckily, what public sectors do to affect land use. Otherwise, we wouldn't have scope for doing anything. So we're happy to hear this. But yeah, what to do? Now, one thing I think is the value of this kind of research that we did in ESPON is by collecting examples all over Europe, you can inspire yourself as a policymaker with other examples, not to implement that as a policy transfer and transplantation, but just to see, hey, it worked there. Maybe that could be inspiring for us. So we see it as a laboratory. And again, no magic bullet. There's no intervention type which we thought that's the one to use. And just some general principles, which many of you have already known: collaboration, coordination, long-term perspective. Of course, these things are conducive to sustainable land use. So to give like some advice, when you craft your interventions, you say, please use our guide, please use these examples to inspire yourself, but don't just try to copy and paste. Experience has shown that many times doesn't work at all, because you have to also look at how it fits your territory. And usually you have to do some tweaking. And one thing that we did find, and maybe sounds contradictory with what I just said, but the idea of this strategy or vision, the long-term strategy or vision, this did seem to work quite well in many cases as a tool, because it was able to take this long-term perspective, let's say no land take in 2050, or compact development or walkability or whatever, and to link it to very short-term measures, let's say like parking requirements or a subsidy for public transit or that sort of thing. So when you take a short-term measure, which might be controversial, like dezoning land, which is many times very controversial, but you've linked it to something long-term, which has public support. Think about the Swiss case. In those cases, we see that you can get some make some broad strides towards sustainable urbanization land use. So thank you very much. And that, in a nutshell, is the super project.